Scary telling.
I woke up to the sound of silence. The room was still dark, the air cold and damp. I turned over, expecting to see my wife next to me. But the bed was empty. That's when I noticed something was off. The room was too quiet. My wife, who usually snores softly, was not making a sound. I sat up, calling her name. No answer. I got out of bed and walked over to her side. That's when I saw her. She was lying on her back, eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling. But she wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. Panic seized me. I shook her, calling her name again and again. But she remained still, her gaze fixed on some distant point. I reached for the phone, but it was dead. The power was out. I had no way to call for help. I tried CPR, but it was no use. My wife was gone. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were coming from outside, somewhere in the darkness beyond our bedroom window. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me in my state of shock. But then, the footsteps grew louder. And I heard something else, something that chilled me to the bone. Laughter. A low, sinister chuckle that echoed through the night. I knew then that I wasn't alone. Someone was out there, watching me. And they were enjoying my pain. I stumbled over to the window, trying to see who or what was out there. But it was too dark. I couldn't see anything beyond the glass. And then, the laughter stopped. In its place, I heard a voice. "I see you," it said. "I see everything." I recoiled, pulling away from the window. Who was this? What did they want? And then, the power came back on. The room was flooded with light, blinding me for a moment. When I opened my eyes again, I saw the figure outside. It was a woman, or at least, it looked like one. But her face was twisted, grotesque, like it had been molded out of clay by a mad sculptor. Her eyes were wide, almost bulging out of their sockets, and her mouth was stretched into a gaping smile that revealed jagged, yellow teeth. I screamed, backing away from the window. But the woman just stood there, grinning at me, her eyes locked onto mine. And then, she vanished. Just like that, as if she had never been there at all. I collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down my face. My wife was gone, and now, I was being stalked by some deranged, supernatural creature. But I refused to be a victim. I knew I had to fight back. I got up, determined to find out what this thing was, and how to stop it. As I searched the house, I found more and more evidence that something was wrong. The windows were locked from the inside, but there were scratches on the glass, as if someone had been trying to claw their way in. And then, I found it. A small, clay figure, almost identical to the woman I had seen outside. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, staring up at me with its blank, lifeless eyes. I knew then that this was no ordinary haunting. This was something much, much worse. But I refused to be scared. I smashed the figure, destroying it with a hammer, hoping that would be enough to banish this creature for good. But as I turned around, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Another clay figure, just like the first, was standing on the counter behind me. And then, another one appeared, and another. They were multiplying at an alarming rate. I was surrounded by them, surrounded by those grotesque, lifeless faces. I ran as fast as I could, out of the house and into the street. But they followed me, dozens of them, crawling out of the darkness, pursuing me with their silent, sinister grins. I knew then that there was no escaping this horror. I was doomed to spend eternity with these clay monsters, these twisted reflections of my own fears and grief. And so, I stopped running. I turned to face them, defiant to the end. I screamed at them, raged at them, demanded to know what they wanted. But they remained silent, their expressions never changing. They just kept multiplying, surrounding me with their lifeless bodies, until I was consumed by their endless, silent gaze. And then, I woke up. It had all been a nightmare. My wife was still sleeping next to me, and the room was bathed in soft, reassuring light. But the memory of that horror remained, etched into my mind like a scar. I knew then that I would never forget it, that I would carry it with me for the rest of my life. And I knew that, no matter how hard I tried to forget it, those clay figures would always be waiting for me, just beyond the threshold of my dreams. I was sitting in my room, browsing through my social media feed when I heard a knock on my door. I opened the door to find my friend, Sarah, standing outside. She looked concerned, and her eyes were fixed on me. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Why do you ask?" I replied. "I heard you breathing heavily from the hallway," she said. "Is everything all right?" I was surprised by her question. I hadn't even realized that I was breathing heavily. I shook my head and told her that I was fine. She looked at me for a moment before nodding and walking away. I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. Why did Sarah hear me breathing heavily when I wasn't? I tried to ignore the thought and went back to scrolling through my phone. That's when I heard it. It was a faint sound, almost imperceptible. But I heard it, and it made my heart race. It was a slow and steady breathing sound. It sounded like it was coming from the corner of my room. I turned to look, but I couldn't see anything unusual. I shrugged it off as my imagination playing tricks on me and went back to my phone. But the breathing sound didn't stop. It grew louder and louder until it felt like it was right next to my ear. I jumped up, startled, and turned on the lights. But there was no one in my room. I was alone. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was just my imagination. But the breathing sound continued, and I couldn't shake it off. I decided to leave my room and go for a walk to clear my head. As I walked down the street, I couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was following me. I looked around, but there was no one there. I picked up my pace and tried to ignore the feeling. But as I turned a corner, I saw a figure standing at the end of the street. It was a shadowy figure, tall and menacing. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew that it was looking right at me. I froze in fear, unable to move or scream. The figure started walking towards me, and I knew that I had to run. I turned around and ran as fast as I could, but the figure was getting closer and closer. I could hear its footsteps echoing behind me, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before it caught up with me. I didn't know what to do, so I stopped and turned around. But there was no one there. The figure had disappeared into thin air. I stood there, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That's when I heard it again. The slow and steady breathing sound right next to my ear. I turned around, but there was no one there. I was alone on the street, but I could feel someone or something watching me. From that day on, I couldn't escape the phantom breath that followed me everywhere. It was always there, haunting me, and reminding me of the darkness that lurked in the shadows. I never found out what it was, but I knew that I would never forget the sound of its breath. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand next to me. I groggily reached for it, expecting to see a message from my friend who always texts me at odd hours. But instead, I saw something that sent a shiver down my spine. There was a picture of me sleeping on my bed, taken from an angle that could only have been from inside my room. My heart raced as I scanned the room for any signs of an intruder, but there was no one there. I lived alone in a small apartment, and I always made sure to lock all the doors and windows before going to bed. I couldn't understand how someone had managed to get in and take a picture of me without waking me up. I felt violated, exposed, and vulnerable. I couldn't shake off the feeling that someone had been watching me, lurking in the shadows of my room, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I didn't sleep much that night, and the next morning, I went straight to the police station to file a report. They listened to my story, but there was little they could do without any evidence or a clear suspect. Days turned into weeks, and the picture in my phone continued to haunt me. I couldn't help but wonder who had taken it and why. Was it someone I knew, or was it a complete stranger? I started to notice little things around my apartment that seemed out of place. A book that was on the shelf was now on the table. A cup that I had left on the counter was now in the sink. It was as if someone had been moving things around, trying to throw me off balance. I became paranoid, checking every nook and cranny of my apartment for any signs of an intruder. But there was never anything there. It was as if whoever was watching me was always one step ahead, always out of sight. And then, one night, I heard a noise coming from my closet. I approached it cautiously, my heart racing with fear. I opened the door, and there, lying on the floor, was my phone. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. The camera app was open, and it was recording a video of me as I stood frozen in fear, staring at my phone. I screamed, and I ran out of my apartment, not stopping until I was a safe distance away. When I finally composed myself, I went back to my apartment, but everything was exactly as I had left it. There was no sign of anyone having been there. I knew then that I had to take matters into my own hands. I set up cameras all around my apartment, hoping to catch whoever was watching me in the act. And finally, one night, I caught a glimpse of the uninvited photographer. It was a figure dressed in all black, with a hood pulled over their head, so I couldn't see their face. I called the police immediately, and they arrived at my apartment within minutes. But when we searched the apartment, there was no one there. The police suggested that I move to a new apartment, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that whoever had been watching me would just follow me wherever I went. And so, I continued to live in fear, always watching over my shoulder, always wondering when the uninvited photographer will strike again. I was in the process of setting up my new storefront, a popcorn store that I had been dreaming of for years. I had finally saved enough money to open it up and was beyond excited. As I was waiting for my shipment of popcorn machines and supplies to arrive, I received a phone call from the shipping company letting me know that my order had arrived. I was thrilled to hear this and made my way to the storefront as quickly as possible. When I arrived, I was greeted by a large wooden crate and several cardboard boxes. I eagerly opened them up to reveal the various popcorn machines and accessories I had ordered. But then, I noticed something odd. Among the machines were 4 life-size mannequins wrapped in bubble wrap. I was confused, as I hadn't ordered any mannequins, but I figured it must have been a mistake by the shipping company. I shrugged it off and went to work setting up the machines. But as I was working, I began to hear a faint popping sound coming from the main room. At first, I thought it was just the popcorn popping in the machines, but the sound continued even when the machines weren't turned on. As I made my way to the main room, the popping sound grew louder and louder until it sounded like a symphony of popcorn popping. When I entered the room, I was met with a surreal sight. The mannequins were unwrapped and standing in a row, with their heads tilted back and their mouths gaping open. Each one had a kernel of popcorn in its mouth, and as the popping sound continued, I watched in horror as their jaws slowly moved up and down, as if they were chewing. I tried to run out of the store, but the door was stuck, as if it had been locked from the outside. I was trapped inside with the mannequins and the incessant popping sound. The mannequins' jaws continued to move, and I could hear their joints creaking and cracking as they slowly began to move their arms and legs. Suddenly, the popping sound stopped, and the mannequins came to life. They stepped down from their pedestals and began to walk towards me, their limbs moving in a jerky, unnatural manner. Their eyes were lifeless, and their mouths were still gaping open with kernels of popcorn spilling out. I backed away as they got closer and closer, until I was backed up against the wall. I closed my eyes, expecting the worst, but instead, I felt something cold and hard in my hand. I opened my eyes to see that I was holding a popcorn scoop. I swung it at the mannequins, hitting them with all my might until they shattered into a million pieces. The popping sound had stopped, and the mannequins were gone. I was alone in the store once again, surrounded by the broken pieces of the mannequins. But as I looked around, I noticed that the walls were covered in what looked like a mixture of popcorn and blood. I realized then that I had been tricked. The mannequins had been sent to me as a warning. The popcorn in their mouths was poisoned, and I had been lucky to find the popcorn scoop just in time to defend myself. As I stumbled out of the store, I saw a figure in the shadows watching me. It was a man dressed in all black, with a sinister grin on his face. He tipped his hat to me and disappeared into the night. From that day on, I never opened the popcorn store again. The mannequins had been a warning, and I knew that if I continued down that path, I would meet a grisly fate. I had always wanted a child, a little girl that I could dress up and play with. But life had other plans for me, and I found out that I could never have children of my own. So, I turned to collecting dolls, filling my house with all kinds of beautiful and unique dolls that I could dress up and take care of. But there was one doll that stood out to me, one that I knew I had to have the moment I saw it. It was a porcelain doll with delicate features, dressed in the prettiest pink dress I had ever seen. I bought the doll and placed it on the shelf in my bedroom, where I could see it every day. It quickly became my favorite doll, and I spent hours taking care of it, brushing its hair, and dressing it up in different outfits. But as time went on, strange things started happening. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find the doll's eyes open, staring at me with an eerie stillness that sent chills down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but the feeling of unease never left me. And then, one night, I had a dream that changed everything. In the dream, I was holding the doll, and it suddenly came to life in my arms. It started speaking to me, telling me its name was Emily and that it had been born still. It begged me to take care of it, to be its mother. I woke up in a cold sweat, but the feeling of the doll's porcelain skin in my dream lingered on my fingertips. The next day, I started to notice that the doll's dress was getting tighter, as if it was growing. And then, I saw it move, just slightly, but enough to send a shock of fear through me. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling of unease never left me. And then, one night, I woke up to find the doll's porcelain eyes staring right at me. It spoke to me, just like in my dream, telling me that it was alive and that it needed me. It begged me to take care of it, to be its mother. And then, I saw something that I could not ignore. The doll's dress had ripped open, and I could see a tiny, stillborn baby inside. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to run, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. And then, the doll spoke again, telling me that it needed me to take care of the baby, to be its mother. I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake, that I had brought something into my home that should have been left alone. And now, as I sit here in my darkened room, I can hear the doll's porcelain eyes staring at me, and I know that I am not alone.